awards, including a Peabody Award. She's also won a Genius Giant. She's also has earned the John Chancellor Award for Distinguished Journalism. She's also been recently inducted into the Society of American Historians, and she co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting. And so, leading to our first discussion question, what were your biggest takeaways from reading the 1619 Project?
The biggest takeaway from the book is that a lot of people, I guess, internationally haven't grappled with the pervasiveness, the role of the Atlantic slave trade in almost every aspect of society today. A lot of people hadn't recognized how it's not something that you can just remove yourself from after so much time or after certain laws are in place. I think that that's my biggest takeaway, is that the number of people who hadn't grappled with the concept that something so catastrophic could perpetuate into multiple areas of society.
The economy of the country is built on having a lower class. And so the upper class is always going to fight to keep there being a lower class any way they can.
Much of modern American life has been shaped not by the majestic ideals of our founding, but by its grave hypocrisy.
One book I think it wasn't by John Thompson. It was by John Thompson, or about John Thompson's life. And he said something about his father gave him the best advice he ever had is, don't listen to what white people say. Look at what they do. And we had a founding fathers and presidents who talked about all men being created equal, who actually had slaves. So, instead of the ideals of the country are perfect or wonderful, but we didn't live up to them, and we had no intentions of living up to them. So that is total grave hypocrisy. And that's how our country was built. And it's going on today with the systems in place, with the economics, with the healthcare, everything that 1619 was written about. And just to jump back to the previous question, what my biggest takeaway of this book so far is that we were lied to. Plain and simple, we were lied to.
You heard of critical race theory, and if so, what is your opinion on it?
I guess all of us at this point have heard of critical race theory, and my opinion on it is I don't know if it should be taught, because I don't know if critical race theory itself is a real thing. I think that critical race theory is a real umbrella term at this point that kind of covers anything that anyone may disagree with at any point. So I think we have all of these lessons through history that can be identified and looked at through multiple lenses. And I think race is a really important way that we should look at historical events. But I don't think that purely looking at events through a racial lens is the only way to identify what has happened in history. So I think critical race theory itself is kind of confusing, but I do think it's important to look at race and how it shaped historical events and shaped our culture in present day.
I've just been recently introduced to critical race theory over the past year. So I think what Nicholas said was very important. Definitions are very important. When you say critical race theory, and I'm going to stereotype a little bit, white people think teachers are going to walk into the classroom and say white people are evil and the devil. That's exactly what they picture. But and I'm a little older than probably most of you. I remember textbooks that showed the hierarchy of races, with Asians being at the top and Negroids being at the bottom, taught in classrooms. And I didn't hear any of these conservatives jumping up and down saying to burn those textbooks. So I say that to say this, that I think it's important to teach critical race theory in the perspective that there's systems, laws, regulations, and rules, and there's a structural racial problem. Not that any one individual is racist, because you'll hear people say, my parents didn't have slaves, I don't own slaves, what are you guys complaining about? To me, critical race theory says there's systems in place that hold certain people at an unequal advantage. And I think, based on the 1619 work, I think that should be discussed or taught. And I don't know if that makes sense.
Part of the book where they were talking about the quote civilization of indigenous people, right? So when we think civilization, we don't think that means taking slaves, but that was one of the requirements for indigenous people to be civilized. They had to pursue owning slaves. They had to, instead of
That
operating,
had to have a hierarchy that was defined by someone else. Absolutely.
exactly. And so that's what this whole idea of what truth is. Civilization is not owning slaves. Civilization is not shirking communal living to operate as a rugged individualist, but that's how it was defined for them, so that they could have a certain place in society, and so slaves could be beneath them, they could be here, and the powers that be could be there. I mean, it was all, I don't know. It's so upsetting when you sit back and look at how manipulated everything was. It's jaw-dropping.
Okay, I also want to add, I think this is a good moment to reflect on the Willie Lynch letters and just the making of a slave, what you have to do to have somebody not violently fight slavery. You have to control their mind, right? And it's that Carter G. Woodson quote from Miseducation of the Negro, if you can control a man's thinking, you control him. So if you can control what he even has awareness of, that's the whole game.
The whitewashing slavery, I think you could also say it has to do with the world's view of America, right? How can America be the moral authority of the world with the history like the one we have? How can we say things like Russia is bad for invading Ukraine when Russia can just come around and say, look at your history? If every time we try to impose democracy and freedom in the world, all the country has to do is say, well, look at your history. So it's a lot easier for America to pretend like that history didn't happen than to try to defend it every time they try to go and impose their views somewhere else.
What are historical examples of white fear impacting Black communities? And have there been any long-term effects?
Oh yeah, and I definitely agree, especially with what you said during the chat, especially with the Tulsa Massacre. That's definitely a great example of white fear impacting Black communities, as with the Tulsa Massacre. As you know, the white community basically destroyed and massacred Black Wall Street all to the ground, and that definitely had a dear economic devastation to it, as well as destroyed all their property. They didn't regain any of the property back, especially to the survivors, and there's multiple unmarked graves there as well. They're currently now trying to dig up the fallen remains of the Tulsa Massacre and anything left of it. So it's such examples of these that definitely have a lot of long-term effects for the community as a whole, because you never know what Black Wall Street would have become today. It would have definitely become a really booming town today from when it was back in the 1920s. What role has stereotypes and false narratives, beliefs played in the historical mistreatment of Black people? How do these stereotypes and narratives circulate? So this is open for discussion. Feel free to come up.
This whole conversation, how we live amongst ourselves with each other, all the different rules that were in place, even what's going on in the NFL, which is becoming very blatant as it relates to the fact that, NFL billionaire owners do not want an African-American Black owner, because they know that the effect of that Black ownership in the NFL will be similar to the Black ownership in the NBA, which is still only one or two, I assume, maybe one Black person, which is Michael Jordan and some other minorities. So I used to get frustrated. I don't now. I try to participate and align with people like this on the call to make me feel good as a human being.
One thing I think is that, one, I thought this was just going to be one big book about, that was just compiled from 1619 and forward. But seeing that it's different authors with different perspectives that are all sharing information, I think that it just kind of inspires me to, one, learn more about our history, and then also effectively communicate it and have discussions like this as it relates. And that's what will make us culturally responsible.